For reference, this story took place around 6 years ago. At the time, I was an 18-year-old girl with a lot of home problems. I had been dating my boyfriend for around 2 years by this point. He was Austrian and I was American. Due to our long-distance relationship, we decided that once I turned 18, we would start our gap year of traveling and working weird jobs in between. Since I was in a super toxic environment, I decided to go to Europe for an indefinite amount of time. I got a job as an au pair in Rome, and my boyfriend and I moved down to Italy to live there for 2 months. The story takes place in Rome. Shortly after settling into my new family's house, I left their house to meet up with my boyfriend. Since I had just gotten there, I didn't even worry about my cell phone, and so figuring I can rely on public Wi-Fi, I didn't purchase a SIM card right away. Bad decision. The location that we were meeting at was around a 25-minute walk away from where I was living, and since the public transport was not reliable, I decided I could walk the way with a downloaded map of Rome. I, anyway, wanted to see Rome in the night and how it lights up and becomes literally abandoned. Coming from New York, I was not used to a major city actually becoming quiet and resting for the night. I was starting to get a little sketched out after 10 minutes or so of walking through the empty old streets. Following the map, I was led to a strange-shaped pyramid building, and walking behind it, I was slowly gaining the sense that I was no longer walking alone. I started a speed walk to at least be on the sidewalk of a street and not behind a dark building with no lights. When I reached the sidewalk, I had that terrible feeling that comes over you when you know you're in actual danger. I turn around to find a 50-something-year man walking around 20 feet behind me. I quickly started to pick up walk to a fast-paced one, and when I turned around again, he had already cut the distance in half and was sprinting to me. The look on his face was pure rage, anger. At this point, I started booking it and running as fast as I can. Hearing the footsteps behind me sprinting is still a haunting feeling to this day. I ran ahead to a busy street and ran across to the other side. Out of breath and crying, I stood watching the man across the street try to cross, but fortunately for me, the light turned green and the cars were flowing, so he couldn't cross. He began to scream and just have an utter meltdown. He was just outraged. I fled at this point, ran as fast as I could to a bridge nearby, where thankfully my boyfriend was at. Since I took so long to get to the meeting point, he began to ride his bike to come and meet me. I hopped on the bike seat while he stood up and pedaled, and we got out of there fast. I don't know what his intentions were, and I'm glad I never found out. So to every person out there, avoid all the faults and mistakes I did. Never leave without a charged working phone. Try to avoid dark areas, unpopulated areas, and the moment you feel like something isn't right, it probably isn't. So about 6 years ago, I was the ripe age of 21, and I was home from college for the summer and living with my parents. This is deep Texas suburbia, so the houses are all cookie-cutter houses, built around the same time by the same developer. Every few blocks, there's a pool or a park of some sort. Well, every year, the community people, I honestly don't know how this gets organized or by whom, have a Rock the Park event at one of the pools or parks within walking distance of my house. Some old guys bring their garage bands and cover songs by Aerosmith and the Eagles, etc. The pool stays open late. There's a playground, and you can hear the music from every corner of the park. It wasn't too loud though, unless you were nice and close. Well, my parents went on a dinner date that night, so I decided, with my 21-year-old brain, to pour some vodka into my Coca-Cola bottle and walk up to the park for some tunes and a good time. It's only about a block away from me, so I get there pretty quick, and down a good amount of my vodka along the way. I'm feeling pretty good by the time I get there, so I head right up to the closest bench to the stage. They were just standing within some cones and speakers on the grass. There's a person sitting on the far edge of the bench, but I don't really pay attention to him at first. There's a good 4 feet of empty bench between us. It didn't take long, however, for him to strike up a conversation. He had a bony face and looked to be at least 30. He said hello, how are you, etc. I was polite back, but pulled out my phone to fuck around, so he might get the message that I don't really want to talk. He asks if I'm having a good time, and like a fool, I tell him that of course I am. I'm a couple shots worth of vodka in. I shook my Coke bottle, and the small amount left in it fizzed. That's when he started to ease his way in. I stayed on the far edge of the bench, but as he kept talking to me, he kept moving closer. He asked if I lived around here, and I said yeah, don't worry, I walked. I honestly thought he was asking, because I was not sober enough to drive. He told me he lived in some vague direction, and then asked if he could have my number. I started getting uncomfortable, because for the first time in my life, I was alone somewhere, and in a compromised state. I told him I didn't know him that well, and he said something like,
"Okay, well, get to know me."
I told him I needed to walk around because the music was too loud and I had to make a phone call. I ventured to the other side of this large playground equipment with lots of climbable walls and tubes. I make sure he can't see me, but I know he watched where I went. I texted a bunch of my friends from college telling them what was going on and asking for advice. They told me to leave, but I knew that he could see me and I didn't want him to follow. I started hitting up my friends from high school, hoping some might be home for the summer already, and luckily, one of my friends was. I told her what was happening, and I asked if she could come save me. She said she could, but she couldn't make it for another 20 to 30 minutes, which was still well before the event ended. I went over to a different part of the playground where the swings were, and I took a seat where I could see the stage, hoping maybe he'd forget about me and leave me alone. Sure enough, the moment I sit, he's approaching the swings. He takes the one next to me and starts trying to be like,
"What did you want to know about me? What do you need to know?"
I was like, actually, I'm getting really tired. I'm probably gonna go home soon. I just want to enjoy the music a bit longer without talking. That was when he became adamant about walking me home. It was a suggestion at first, but the more I told him no and that I'd be fine, the more aggressive he got about it. My parents wouldn't be home for another few hours, so if I did go home and he followed, he'd know where I live and have me alone. He asked which direction I lived in, and I pointed to the opposite direction of my parents' house. He got up and he took a few steps in that direction, then turned back to me like he expected me to follow. I told him that I wasn't ready to go home, but it became very clear that if I was walking home that night, he was coming, whether I wanted him to or not. He stayed near me for the next 10 minutes or so until my friend arrived. I saw her car pull up and immediately got to my feet like, "Hey, that's my friend," and I sped off towards her car. She parked and got out and started heading back towards the park. I was like, "No, hey, we gotta go now," but it was too late. He followed me and touched my shoulder. He said,
"Hey, wait, you promised to give me your number."
I hadn't, but I felt rather trapped and figured that if I gave him a fake number, he'd be satisfied enough to let me leave. Sure enough, immediately after I spouted off, he calls it and starts looking at my phone, expecting it to ring. That's when my friend goes, "Hey, Thorhees, didn't your phone die?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I forgot. I'll get you later, man. Text me." And I waved to him, and we both sped walked back to her car. He didn't follow, but he watched us drive away. I told her to go the opposite direction of my house and to take the long way around. So, to the guy who killed my rocking park vibes and my confidence in being out in public alone, let's not meet. So about a year and a half ago, I was 16. I'd taken a job of babysitting my aunt's dog in the Bronx while she was away on business. I don't exactly know the breed, but this dog was a powerhouse, more than capable of taking someone down. Her name is Dolly. I had to introduce myself to her in my aunt's presence to ensure she knew who I was before showing up alone later. I was told to walk her about 4 times a day. She's very well trained and doesn't bark really, which is what makes this encounter more creepy. It was late, like 2 a.m., and she adorably woke me up for a walk by digging her nose into my arm. When we began our walk, it was really dark out. You wouldn't be able to see anyone's face from a few feet away. The streets were empty, but that's expected at 2 a.m. In this suburban kind of area in the Bronx, the sidewalks are very narrow. You can't walk down it in twos. Dolly was slow because she liked to smell literally every molecule on the sidewalk. Here's the creepy encounter. There was a man who was walking down the same sidewalk as us, maybe about 10 feet behind. Dolly went off the sidewalk to where the grass was to sniff a treat. I knew with her that could take years to be done, so I kind of signaled the man, who was a lot closer now, to go on by, and I stepped off the narrow sidewalk onto the grass. And I was right. Dolly took forever sniffing this treat. Genuinely think it was about 10 to 15 minutes. I didn't have a problem with it taking long because I was listening to good music with AirPods, and watching her go around this tree was an enjoyable sight. Then, all of a sudden, Dolly begins barking ferociously at something behind me. It startled the crap out of me because it was so abrupt, and I hadn't ever seen her bark like that. I quickly turned around to see what would make her do this, and there was the same man. He hadn't gone any more forward in the direction he was coming in since I signaled him to pass me, still about 5 feet away. He wasn't on his phone. He was standing there just looking at me. Dolly was going crazy at him, and he had little to no reaction. Now I got a closer look at him. He was very tall, taller than me, and I'm 6'3". He was bald, and his face was expressionless, although half of it was covered by the darkness of the night. I realized that the dude must have just stood there staring at me for 10 to 15 minutes. He definitely wasn't trying to talk to me in that time, because my music wasn't that loud. I would have heard him, and I don't think he was admiring the dog, because even with her barking, his eyes were zoned in on me. We had about a 10-second moment of staring each other in the face. Normally, I would have asked him if he needed something, but I just had the worst feeling ever. He right away reminded me of the dancing tall smiley man creepypasta story, which I think was the cause for my fear in the moment. I turned from him, and I felt safe with this ginormous dog. I took my AirPods out of my ears so I could hear if he followed. Dolly walked with me, but her eyes stayed on him the whole time. Instead of continuing down the same street, I crossed the block. As I started to do this, I shit you not, this man absolutely sprinted in the opposite direction he was originally heading in. The sound of his feet rapidly hitting the floor sent an uppercut to my guts. I quickly turned around and watched him do this. He ran as if his life depended on it. I watched him run till he turned the corner and was out of view. I held Dolly's leash tight and hurried back to the house. I don't think he followed, but Dolly kept looking back and growling. When we got back, I locked the door and made sure Dolly slept in bed with me.